Well, thanks for being here, you guys. Today, we're going to talk about 611 and 619 allowable uses. Uh, Okay, this is just a quick kind of visual of where our team sits under ODE, OES. So there we are, resource management operations. These are like to, ground our presentations, remind ourselves of who we are here for, over 500,000 students, 8,000 educators. This is our equity stance that we implement as a state, kind of the lens that we use when we are thinking about all of our work, even our fiscal work. Okay, so 611, 619, Part C. I think sometimes with IDEA, it can get kind of confusing having all these kind of like similar terms and everything. But for Part B, 611 and 619, you're going to have the same allowable uses. So 611, 619 can be used for the same things. And then Part C has some different parameters. So we'll have another training where we talk a little bit more about the difference between Part B and Part C. And right now we're just looking at the Part B, 611, 619. And the main difference between 611 and 619 and even Part C is just the age difference that's to be served. So your 611 funds, that's your biggest pot of money. That's for students ages 3 to 21. And then your 619, usually quite a bit smaller amount of money, is specifically for your preschool students, ages 3 to 5, so up through their 5th year. And then Part C is for birth to 2 or birth to 3 under 3 years old. So when we're looking at 611, 619, the way that we decide if an expense is going to be allowable, this is what we use at the state level, is more of a decision tree rather than just kind of a list of things that can be used or not used for. So the first thing that we would look at is the excess cost. Excuse me. And so to determine that, we look at these 3 questions. The first one, in the absence of special education needs, would this cost exist? So if we're looking at something like a stander, if you're trying to determine if you can use your IDEA funds to purchase a stander for students, you would take a look at this first question and say, okay, in the absence of special education needs, would this cost exist? Will we need this stander? The answer is no. Then you're going to, move on to the next question that it is an excess cost. If this need existed outside or without special education needs, then it would not be excess cost. So if we go to that next question, is this cost also generated by students without disabilities? So for a stander, if a student doesn't have a disability, they're likely not going to have the same need. So we can assume no and go on to the next question. If it's a child-specific service, is the service documented in the student's IEP? So in this case, a stander would be child-specific. Is this documented in the student's IEP? The answer is yes, then it's an excess cost. The answer is no, and a student needs a stander. You should maybe have a conversation with your student's IEP team, because the stander should probably be on their IEP to make sure that it is allowed. And that's another kind of aspect to determining if something is an excess cost or allowable is if it's documented on the student's IEP. If a student has a need documented on an IEP, there's a much greater chance that you're going to be able to get that cost approved for IDEA. So if you're unsure about something, if it's going to count, if it's on their IEP, like definitely keep documenting that, because it's going to make it a lot easier to approve that expenditure. So then on top of the excess cost, if you decide that something is an excess cost, so if we're talking about a stander, then you must also make sure that the cost is reasonable, necessary, and allocable. So reasonable, are you buying like if we're looking at our standard here, are you looking at the standard that meets the needs of the students, but isn't like an outrageous cost? Like you're not buying like a gold plated, jewel encrusted standard for the student. Like that would probably be unreasonable, but, getting a student what they need, even if it's kind of like above your basic level of equipment, if it's something that is documented in the student's IEP that they need this specific equipment or, specific piece of an equipment, whatever it is, then it's reasonable. Necessary, that's kind of covered in that excess cost, in the absence of these needs, would it exist? And then allocable. So when we're looking allocable for 611, it's ages 3 to 21. For 619, it's ages 3 to 5. So if you want to use those 619 funds in order to be allocable to 619, it's got to be for students ages 3 through 5. Here are some examples that you can use 611 or 619 funds. Salaries for substitute teachers, contract employees, transition coaches. We would heavily encourage you, because of the maintenance of effort requirement from the federal regulation and also the need to meet excess cost, we would always recommend that you do kind of your more reliable expenses with your general funds, and then use IDA funds for kind of those, like either one-time costs or kind of supplemental things. So like teachers, you're always going to need a certain amount of teachers. So using general funds to pay for those salaries, but then something like substitute teachers or contracted employees, things that, or positions that aren't permanent, that those are great places to use IDA funds, because that amount can vary from year to year. So not trying to, pin your most necessary expenses on that kind of variable grant. Another allowable use would be professional development. So looking into integrating technology, content, using IDA dollars to get special education certifications for your gen ed teachers. You can use materials and supplies, larger projects like mentorship programs for new teachers. 611 and 619 can be used for travel and transportation for parents and conferences. That one you'd kind of want to take a look at, make sure it's meeting that excess cost requirement, but just knowing that that is an option. Same thing with like workshops, that kind of thing. Another part of 611, 619 funds is coordinated early intervention services, or intervening services, sorry. And we're going to hold another training that specifically dives into these a little bit, or in a little bit more detail, because it can get kind of nuanced. So there's CEIS, which is optional, and then CCEIS, Comprehensive Coordinated Early Intervening Services, that is mandatory. So CEIS, for those, that bucket of funding, an LEA may reserve up to, and it says may there and highlighted, reserve up to 15% of its total award to provide coordinated early intervening services for students ages 3 to grade 12 who are not currently identified as needing special education or related services, but who need additional academic and behavioral support to succeed in a gen ed environment. So basically, this portion, you can set aside this portion of your award and use it for non-SPED students, but in providing additional supports for students, kind of ideally, the aim there is to support students intervene early so that they don't end up having to be identified for special education and needing more services. CCIS is the same thing. It's that same 15% of your award, and it's used for those same purposes, but it is required if your district is found significantly disproportionate. And that it doesn't happen super often. So there's a good chance that your district has never been identified. There's a good chance you might not really be familiar with what that is. So if you'd like to come to our training on that, we will talk about it a little bit more. But if you are required to spend 15% of your award on CCIS, those funds then must be used to identify and address the factors that you were found significantly disproportional for. And there's a real particular emphasis placed on using those funds for students age 3 to grade 3. And for CCIS and CIS, some of the permissible activities for these include professional development and academic and behavior evaluations, sports planning activities, So right there, then we also have a list of, or some examples of the factors that could be identified that would contribute to the identification of significant disproportionality. So it could be a lack of access to scientifically based instruction, economic, cultural, linguistic barriers. There's, just obviously you guys can read these here. A few different routes that you can look at to use your funds to address some of these factors that contribute to significant disproportionality. And then at the bottom here, when these slides go out, there's a resource that's created by our federal partners, and it gives some examples of, or some scenarios for CEIS and CCEIS spending. That's super helpful. So one thing, if you guys are considering using some of your funds for, voluntarily for CEIS, there's a bit of a tracking component to that. Same thing for CEIS. If you are having to provide or set aside this money, there's another tracking component to it as well. So, this is a really great way to use funds. And if you guys are interested in doing that, definitely reach out. We would love to work with you. We just would want to make sure that we've got kind of all of the supports in place so that you're able to keep track of those funds and we can kind of remain in our lane fiscally. So that is it. I'm gonna have Alex stop the recording